In this video, we're going to talk about trunking, specifically using Dynamic Trunking Protocol or DTP. Can you answer some quiz questions about DTP? So, do you know when two switches will form a trunk? What are the conditions to form trunking between two Cisco switches? In this example, I've got two Cisco switches running in GNS3. These are iOS V switches. They are not currently connected, but I'm going to ask you some quiz questions and let's see if you can answer the quiz questions about when trunks will be formed, and then I'll show you the answers by practically demonstrating trunking using these two switches running in GNS3. Okay, so let's see if you can answer the first question. Will a trunk be formed when I connect switch 1 to switch 2 on gigabit Ethernet 00? So firstly, before I do that, show interface trunk shows us that no trunk has been formed on either of these switches. So show interface trunk shows that there are no trunks currently set up on the switches. Show interface gigabit 00 switch port. Do the same here. Show interface gigabit 00 switch port. Will a trunk be formed between these two switches when I connect them using gigabit 00? Will a trunk be formed? If you need more time to answer the question, pause the video at this point. Otherwise, I'm going to show you if a trunk is formed practically using GNS3, and I'll explain the reasons why a trunk is formed and not formed, and also do some Wireshark captures. So again, pause the video at this point if you want to try and work this out for yourself and need some more time. Okay, so let's do this practically. I'll connect gigabit 00 to gigabit 00. So switch 1 is now connected to switch 2. Let's have a look. Show interface trunk. Trunk is still not formed. Show interface trunk still not formed. Now what I'll do is shut the interface down and then no shut it to force the switches to renegotiate. In GNS3, interfaces that are not connected are often shown as up. So as an example, let's do that on switch 1, show IP interface brief. These interfaces are shown as up even though they're not connected. So in GNS3, to force something to happen, shut the interface down and no shut it if you need to rely on a physical connection state changing. So again, show interface trunk. Looks like no trunks have been formed on either switches. So show interface gigabit 00 switch port. Do that command again on both switches. And what you'll be able to see in the output is a trunk will not be formed because the administrative mode is set to dynamic auto on both sides. If a switch is configured as dynamic auto, it doesn't initiate trunking with the other side. It waits for the other side to initiate trunking with it. If both sides are set to dynamic auto, neither of them are going to negotiate trunking or initiate trunking, so no trunking will take place between the two switches. Notice administrative trunking encapsulation is negotiate. Negotiation of trunking is on, but trunking does not form because both sides are set to dynamic auto. We need one side to initiate trunking. Neither side is initiating trunking here, so no trunk is formed. Once again, show interface trunk, no trunk. Show interface gigabit 00 switch port. Notice the operational mode is static access on both sides. Trunk is not formed, static access port at the moment. We can actually see that by running a Wireshark capture on the link between the switches. And what I'll do here is filter for DTP. Again, it may take a while for DTP messages to show up, so what I'll do is shut the link down and then no shut it to try and force some negotiation to take place. Show interface gigabit 00 switch port, still set to dynamic auto. Operational mode is static access. We see some DTP messages here. Notice in the first one, we see access auto, trunk type is ISL negotiated, trunk status is access auto. Sender ID is this. If we look at the second message, so that's the ID of the first switch. Let me close some of these down and I'll stop that Wireshark capture. So first message, sender ID is that. Second message, sender ID is the same. Third message, notice sender ID is different. Both sides are set to ISL negotiated access auto. So we can see that neither side is negotiating trunking with the other side. Both are using DTP. We see DTP messages on the link, but they're both set to access auto. And that's because we're using an administrative mode of dynamic access. Operational mode is static access. Neither side is going to initiate a trunk with the other side. Okay, so I'll stop this capture and delete the link. Okay, let's have a look at gigabit 01. So show interface gigabit 01 switch port. What will happen when gigabit 01 is connected to gigabit 01? So switch 1's gigabit 01 interface is connected to switch 2's gigabit 01 interface. Will a trunk be formed in this example? Interfaces are not connected at the moment. What will happen when I connect interface gigabit 01 to interface gigabit 01? Will a trunk be formed in this example? Once again, pause the video if you need more time to work this out. Otherwise, I'm going to show you practically how this works. Okay, so at the moment, show interface trunk shows us that no trunk has been formed on either switch. So there's no trunk at the moment. Notice the output here. One side is set to dynamic auto, but the other side is set to dynamic desirable. Now this should form a trunk because dynamic desirable means that the one side is going to initiate trunking with the other side. So let's connect gigabit 01 to gigabit 01 and see if that's true practically. What I'll do at the same time is start a Wireshark capture on that link and set up a filter for DTP. Okay, so show interface trunk. We don't see a trunk formed at the moment. So what I'll do is shut this interface down and no shut it to get things to speed up. You don't have to do that. You could just wait a while and then you'll see a result similar to this. But rather than waiting in the video, I'm just going to speed it up. Notice a trunk has been formed on both sides. Notice on this side, gigabit 01 has a mode of auto. On this side, the mode is desirable. They are using ISL. That's been negotiated. So negotiated ISL. These switches support both ISL and 802.1q. By default, they negotiate to use ISL when using DTP. Status is trunking. So trunking is enabled. Native VLAN is VLAN 1. These are the VLANs allowed across the trunk. VLAN 1 is allowed and active in the management domain. That's because show VLAN database, or should I just say show VLAN brief, shows us that only VLAN 1 is currently enabled on Ethernet. We don't worry about these VLANs, they are for FDDI token ring. So the only VLAN we have is VLAN 1, so show interface trunk shows us that that's the only VLAN that's going to be allowed across the trunk at the moment. Okay, so what did we learn? If one side is set to auto and the other side is set to desirable, the desirable side is going to initiate trunking and a trunk will be formed between the two switches. If we look at our Wireshark capture, And I'll stop that for the moment. First Wireshark message, trunk type, ISL negotiated, sender ID is this, trunk status is auto access. As we scroll down, notice we have access desirable. So rather than auto, one side is using desirable. Notice we've got trunk auto with this MAC address ending in 7401. This side ending in 6A01 is desirable. So one side is desirable, other side is auto, and then what they do is they negotiate to form a trunk between them using ISL. So if you're using Dynamic Trunking Protocol and both sides are set to auto, a trunk is not formed. But if one side is set to auto and one side is set to desirable, a trunk will be formed. Okay, but let's have a look at another example. Let's have a look at the configuration before I show you another example. That's the configuration of switch 1. This is the configuration of switch 2. Notice it's set to dynamic desirable. This side hasn't got switchboard mode dynamic set to anything. It's using the default of auto. And again, we can see that here, show interface gigabit 01 switch port. Notice dynamic auto, but the operational mode is currently trunk. Previously, it was an access port. If we scroll back up, notice previously operational mode was static access. Now the mode is trunk. Operational trunking encapsulation is ISL. Let's do the same over here. So gigabit 01. So show interface gigabit 01 switch port. Notice this side, switch port is enabled. It's dynamic desirable. Current operational mode is trunk. Same over here. It's using negotiation for the encapsulation. Currently using ISL. Negotiation of trunking is on. Native VLAN is 1. Okay, so let's have a look at another example. Show interface gigabit 02 switch port. What is this side set to use? And let's have a look at this one. Show interface gigabit 02 switch port. Let's delete. I'm going to stop the Wireshark capture and delete gigabit 01. Gigabit 02 is not connected between these two switches. Will a trunk be formed between these two switches? So have a look at the output. Is DTP enabled on both sides? Let's ask that question first. And will trunking be formed between these two switches? If you need more time, pause the video at this point and see if you can answer those two questions. Is DTP or Dynamic Trunking Protocol used on these switches? And will a trunk be formed when the interfaces are connected? Okay, so first thing, let's connect the switches. Again, if you need more time, pause the video, but I'm going to answer the question now. So I've connected those two interfaces together. I'll start a Wireshark capture. And let's have a look at the output. So show interface gigabit 02. Current mode is static access. This side, current mode is down. Static access, what I'll do actually on this side is shut the interface down and no shut it to make sure that things renegotiate. So let's have a look at the interface. Notice operational mode is now trunk. Administrative mode is trunk. On this side, show interface gigabit 02 switch port. Notice operational mode is dynamic desirable. It's acting as a trunk. This side encapsulation is negotiated. This side it's set statically to .1Q. So if we actually look at the trunk, show interface trunk, this side is still showing gigabit 01 as trunking, even though the interface is not connected. And that's once again a GNS3 issue, because in GNS3 it doesn't realize the interface has gone down. But notice this interface, this is the important one. Notice they have negotiated to use 802.1q trunking, but notice the difference. This side is using 802.1q, this side is using negotiated 802.1q. So this side is not using Dynamic Trunk Protocol. So this side has been statically configured to use .1q. We can see that by looking at the running configuration. Notice configuration has been manually configured. DTP is still enabled on this interface. Notice negotiation of trunking is on, but we've statically configured trunking on switch 2. On this side, show run interface gigabit 02. Notice dynamic desirable is used here. It's not statically configured. It's going to initiate trunking. This side is also going to dynamically try and set up a trunk with the other side, but it's manually configured as a trunk. Some switches, such as this switch, will force you to set the encapsulation before you enable the interface as a trunk. This switch supports both ISL and 802.1q, so you have to specify the encapsulation and then you can specify that it's a trunk. So show interface trunk once again. Notice the difference between gigabit 01 and gigabit 02. This interface is using negotiated ISL. This is statically configured to use 802.1q, whereas on this side they dynamically negotiated to use 802.1q. Okay, so if one side is desirable and one side is statically configured as a trunk will be formed. Okay, so let's have a look at another interface. Show interface gigabit 04 switch port. Let's have a look at gigabit 10. Notice this side is set to dynamic access. It's currently operating as static access. If I stop this Wireshark capture and delete this link and then connect that interface to gigabit 02, will a trunk be formed between these two switches? So this side is dynamic auto. This side, show interface gigabit 02 switch port. This side is set as a trunk administratively. What will happen in this example? So I'll shut the interface down to force renegotiation. And I probably did that too quickly. So shut it down and then no shut it to bring it back up again. Show interface gigabit 02 switch port. So I'm typing the same command over and over again. So I'll just type the full command here. Show interface gigabit 02 switch port. This side is administratively configured as a trunk. This side is using the default of dynamic auto. And I can just show you the running configuration to make that point. Show run interface gigabit 10. Default configuration. Configuration set this side. Will a trunk be formed? And there's kind of a hint over here. Notice the hint. So again, show interface gigabit 10 switch port. Dynamic auto. This side, show interface gigabit 2. Show interface gigabit 02 switch port. Manually configured as a trunk. Will a trunk be formed between these two switches? Pause the video now if you don't want to see the answer and want to work it out yourself. But show interface trunk. Notice a trunk has been set up. Show interface trunk on this side. Notice a trunk has been set up. So if one side is dynamic auto and one side is set as a trunk, but DTP is still being used, a trunk is formed between the two switches. Once again, I'll show you this in a summary table just to recap. But before I do that, let's look at one more example. What will happen when we connect gigabit 03 on both sides? So show interface gigabit 03 switch port. What will happen when this interface is connected to this interface. Notice static access, dynamic auto. Will this form a trunk? So let's see what that does. Connect those two interfaces together. What I'll do is shut the interface down and no shut it to get it to negotiate. Show interface gigabit 03 switch port. Operational mode is currently static access on both sides. Show interface trunk. We don't see gigabit 03 in the output of trunks that have been formed. Show interface trunk. Gigabit 03 has not formed a trunk. So there's no trunking taking place between these two switches. Okay, so let's have a look at a summary, because there's a lot of information here. You need to know this stuff for the CCNA exam. Notice dynamic auto. Dynamic auto will form an access port. No trunk is formed when we have dynamic auto on both sides, and that is what I demonstrated. If one side is set to dynamic desirable and one side is set to dynamic auto, a trunk is formed, as I demonstrated. If one side is set to trunk and one side is set to dynamic auto, a trunk is formed, as I've just shown you. And again, last demonstration, access port, dynamic auto, we have an access port. That's what we're looking at over here. Show run interface gigabit 03. It's an access port. On this side, show interface gigabit 03. And let me do show run run interface gigabit 03. This is using dynamic auto, the default. This is a statically configured access port. Trunking is not formed. So we've seen all of those. These are just variations of that. If one side is set to trunk, other side is set to trunk, a trunk is formed. If you manually set one side to trunk and manually set one side as an access port, you're going to have problems. So you don't want to do that. Again, access to trunk, you're going to have issues. But Cisco recommend that you statically configure trunking wherever you can, and you disable DTP whenever you can. You want to manually configure trunking on your switches. Show DTP interface shows us the status of DTP on various interfaces. So show DTP interface gigabit 00. Notice it's an access port using auto negotiation. On this side, show DTP interface. This side is also access auto. Trunking is not negotiated. Let's look at a specific interface, gigabit 03. That was our last example. This side is using access auto. It's going to negotiate. This side, show DTP interface gigabit 03. This side has negotiation off. This is set up as an access port. It's not negotiating with the other side. This side is using negotiation, but auto negotiation. Okay, so this is the great thing about GNS3. You can test these options out practically and see actually what happens. I mean, you could do that with physical switches as well. Just get two switches, connect them together, and try various options. But I'm hoping that this video and these quiz questions are helping you understand the technology and hopefully show you practically how dynamic trunking protocol works. Now, one last thing we can do is disable trunking on the switches. So previously on gigabit 01, we had dynamic desirable, and on this side, show run interface gigabit 01, we had dynamic access. So this is dynamic access, this is dynamic desirable. What we could do here is say switch port, no negotiate. Don't negotiate with the other side. But notice that has been rejected because we're using dynamic on this side. So what we could say is switch port, mode, and set it as a trunk. So manually configure it as a trunk. But in that case, we still need to specify the encapsulation first. So switch port trunk encapsulation. And in this case, I'll specify .1Q. Now I can type switch port mode trunk and then type switch port no negotiate. That turns off a DTP on the port and manually configures it as a trunk. So in this example, if I delete that link and then connect these two switches back together, we are not negotiating trunking from switch 2 to switch 1. So will a trunk be formed between the two switches? Notice it says trunking has been formed. Let's just confirm that by shutting the interface down and then re-enabling it. So shut and then no shut it. Interface has now been re-enabled. So show, let's do that again, show interface trunk. Gigabit 01 trunking has been enabled. Notice we are manually configuring trunking on this side, but on this side, notice we are getting error messages. Show interface trunk, no trunking here. Show interface gigabit 01 switch port. Notice it's acting as a static access port. It's not initiating trunking, it's waiting for the other side to initiate the trunk. But on this side, we have disabled the initiation of trunking. Notice negotiation of trunking is off. So it's not going to try and initiate trunking from switch 2 to switch 1. Switch 1 is waiting for the other side to negotiate trunking, but that's not happening. So it's acting as an access port, whereas this side is acting as a trunk. One side is operational mode static access, one side is operational mode trunk. We have a problem here. It's not going to work properly. And that's why we see these kind of messages. Spanning tree is blocking ports. This is going to give you a lot of problems because notice no trunk on one side, trunk is configured on the other side. You don't want to do that. You want to manually configure trunking on both sides and then disable DTP. So again, the way you do that is you specify the encapsulation. Some switches will require you to do that. Specify the mode as trunk and then disable DTP. Okay, so again, I hope you found this video useful. I hope you're enjoying these quiz questions. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and please subscribe to my YouTube channel. I'm David Bombal. I want to wish you all the very best.